The holding cell at the Riverside County Police Department smelled bad, and the lights were too bright. Detective Kevin Morrison stood outside the room watching the woman inside, and he was smiling like he thought something was funny. The woman sat at a metal table and her clothes were torn and dirty. Her face had bruises on it, and her hair was messy, but she still sat up straight with her hands folded on the table. Kevin turned to his partner, Officer Brandon Cole, and said, "You believe this woman and what she is telling us?" Brandon looked at the papers in his hand and shook his head while saying, "She claims she works for the federal government, but she has no badge and no identification card and nothing to prove it. She just keeps saying she needs to make a phone call." Kevin laughed and said, "They always have some crazy story to tell us. Last week I arrested a man who said he worked for the CIA, but he was just on drugs and making things up." Inside the room, Detective Lisa Grant was asking the woman questions, and she did not sound like she believed anything. Lisa said, "Let me hear this story one more time, because you are telling me you work for the federal government, but you have no identification. You were found at a crime scene and you were covered in black soot and you smelled like gasoline. You really expect us to just believe you?" The woman looked at Lisa and her voice was calm when she said, "My name is Carmen Williams and I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was working on a secret operation when things went wrong. I need you to contact FBI headquarters right now." Lisa laughed out loud and did not try to hide it. She said, "The FBI director and I am the President of the United States." She leaned back in her chair and kept talking. "You know what I think happened? I think you were living in that warehouse and maybe you were making drugs there and you started that fire to hide what you were doing." Carmen's face got tight, but her voice stayed calm. She said, "Detective Grant, you are making a very big mistake. That warehouse was being used by criminals who were trafficking women and children. My team has been watching it for 6 months. There was an explosion and I got separated from my team." Lisa interrupted her and said, "An explosion that you caused, right?" Carmen kept talking and said, "No, the explosion happened because the criminals set it off when they knew we were coming. My team got out safely, but I was separated when everything went wrong. I lost my badge and my phone in the explosion. All I am asking is that you make one phone call to check if I am telling the truth." Outside the room, Kevin and Brandon looked at each other. Brandon said, "She is good at staying calm and not getting upset, but the story is too crazy to be real." Kevin agreed and said the FBI director would not be rolling around in warehouse fires in Riverside County. He picked up his coffee and said, "Let Lisa keep talking to her and eventually she will tell us the truth. They always do." 2 hours went by and Carmen Williams was still calm and still telling the same story. Lisa Grant was getting frustrated because the woman would not change what she was saying. Lisa stood up and walked around the small room while saying, "You know what is funny? The FBI director really is a black woman named Carmen Williams, but she is probably in Washington, D.C. right now, sitting in her nice office. She is not sitting in a jail cell in Riverside County covered in dirt and smelling like smoke." Carmen's eyes got narrow and she said, "Detective Grant, I am telling you again that you need to check my identity before this gets worse." Lisa said worse and laughed. "Lady, you are already arrested for arson and trespassing and maybe making drugs. I would say things are already pretty bad for you." The door opened and Sergeant Paul Henderson walked in holding papers. He was a big man in his 50s and he did not look happy. He asked Lisa, "What do we have here?" Lisa smiled and said, "This Jane Doe claims she is the FBI director. She will not give us any real information and she just keeps saying we should call some mysterious federal number." Paul looked at Carmen for the first time and his face showed he thought it was funny. He said, "The FBI director and you have got to be joking with me." Carmen said, "I am Director Carmen Williams and my badge number is FD2471. I was running an operation against a trafficking network at the warehouse on 5th and Morrison. I need you to contact FBI headquarters right now." Paul waved his hand at her and said, "Save it. I have been doing this job for 27 years and I have heard every lie and every story and every excuse. You are not the first person to claim they are someone important to try to get out of trouble." Carmen said, "Sergeant Henderson, you need to listen to me very carefully." Paul leaned on the table with both hands and said, "No, you need to listen to me. You are going to be charged with arson. And if we find drugs in that warehouse, you are looking at more charges. Now you can make this easy and tell us the truth, or you can keep playing pretend and watch those charges pile up higher and higher." Carmen took a slow breath and anyone could see she was trying to stay calm. She said, "I am telling you the truth. That warehouse was being used to traffic women and children across state lines. My team had cameras and recording equipment inside. We had warrants for everything. Everything was legal until the criminals set off a bomb." Lisa said, "How convenient that all the evidence burned up in a fire you claim you did not start." Carmen said, "Detective, the evidence is not gone. There are 3 FBI surveillance vans within 2 blocks of that location right now. There are agents who can verify who I am, but they think I have already been picked up because I lost my radio in the explosion." Paul stood up straight and looked at Lisa. He said, "She is sticking to her story, I will give her that much." Lisa said, "They always do when they are crazy and making things up." Carmen said in a harder voice, "I am not crazy. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you are breaking federal law by holding a federal agent without checking if it is true. When you find out I'm telling the truth, and you will find out every single person in this building who treated this like a joke will face serious problems." Carmen said, "Ryan, this is Carmen Williams. Authentication code, Delta 7, November 4, Echo Zulu." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Ryan's voice came back sounding worried and sharp. He said, "Director, ma'am, we have been trying to find you for the past 4 hours. What is your situation right now?" Carmen said, "I am being held at the Riverside County Police Department. I was arrested after the warehouse operation went wrong. I lost all my identification and communication equipment in the blast." Ryan said a curse word quietly and then said, "They arrested you. Do they know who you are?" Carmen said, "I have told them many times, but they do not believe me." Brandon's smile was fading now as he listened to how professional Carmen sounded and how urgent the person on the phone was being. Ryan asked, "What is the exact address of the building you are in?" Carmen gave him the address and also gave him the names of the main officers who had been involved in keeping her there. Ryan said, "I am sending a response team right now. They will be there in 20 minutes. Are you in any immediate danger?" Carmen said, "No, I am not in danger. Just being treated like a common criminal, which is annoying but not life-threatening." Ryan said, "Director, I am so sorry this happened. If I had known you were separated during the extraction, I would have." Carmen interrupted him and said, "It is not your fault, Ryan. The situation got bad faster than any of us expected, but I need you to do something for me before the team arrives." Ryan said, "Anything." Carmen said, "Contact the Riverside County Police Chief directly. Explain what is happening and let them know that a federal response team is coming. I do not want this to turn into a big jurisdictional problem. These officers are ignorant, but they are not trying to be malicious." Ryan said, "Understood. Are you absolutely certain you are okay?" Carmen said, "I am fine. Just annoyed that a 6-month operation might be compromised because I spent the evening in a holding cell instead of coordinating the follow-up." Ryan said, "The tactical team secured 12 suspects at the secondary location. We got them, Director. The operation was a success despite the complications." For the first time since being arrested, Carmen's expression softened a little. She said, "Good. That is very good. How many victims did we recover?" Ryan said, 19 women and children. They are being processed through victim services right now." Carmen said, "Thank you, Ryan. I will see you in about 20 minutes. Ryan said, "Yes, ma'am, and Director, welcome back." Carmen hung up the phone and turned to face Brandon. His expression had changed from amusement to uncertainty and maybe worry. He said, "That sounded pretty official." Carmen said, "That is because it was official. In about 20 minutes, a federal response team is going to arrive at this building. Shortly after that, your police chief is going to get a very uncomfortable phone call. I suggest you tell Sergeant Henderson that he might want to prepare himself." Brandon swallowed hard and said, "You are serious about all this?" Carmen said, "I have been serious this entire time, Officer Cole. You just chose not to believe me." As Brandon walked Carmen back to her cell, his swagger was completely gone. He was quiet and clearly thinking hard about what all this meant. Back in the holding cell, Kelly Davis looked up as Carmen came back. She asked, "How did the call go?" Carmen sat down on the bench and said it was productive. "Things should start moving very quickly now." Kelly said, "You really were not kidding about being someone important, were you?" Carmen shook her head and said, "I never kid about who I am." Meanwhile, in the main office area, Brandon found Kevin Morrison and pulled him aside. He said quietly, "We might have a serious problem." Kevin asked, "What kind of problem?" Brandon said, "That woman who claims to be the FBI director. Her phone call sounded real. Like really real. Official codes and federal response teams and everything." Kevin's face went pale and he said, "You are joking." Brandon said, "I wish I was joking." She said, "Someone is going to call the chief." She said, "We have about 20 minutes before people show up." Kevin asked, "Show up what people?" Brandon said, "Federal agents, apparently." The two officers stared at each other as the reality started to sink in. Kevin said, "We need to tell Henderson right now." Brandon said, "Tell Henderson what exactly?" "That we might have accidentally arrested and mocked the actual FBI director for the past 5 hours. Kevin said better he hears it from us than from whoever is about to walk through that door. They found Sergeant Paul Henderson in his office looking at paperwork. When they explained what Brandon had heard on the phone call, Paul's reaction was immediate and he used several curse words. He said, "You were telling me that woman might actually be Carmen Williams. The real Carmen Williams," Brandon said carefully. "I am saying her phone call sounded very legitimate. She used authentication codes and talked about an operation and mentioned a response team." Paul stood up and his face was red. He said, "And nobody thought to actually verify her story when she first asked us to do it." Kevin said defensively she did not have any identification. She was at a crime scene. What were we supposed to think? Paul snapped at him and said, "You were supposed to do your job. That includes verifying information, not just assuming everyone is lying." He grabbed his phone and said, "Get Lisa in here right now." 18 minutes after Carmen's phone call, 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the Riverside County Police Department. The vehicles barely stopped before agents in dark suits got out. Their faces showed they were very serious and determined. Deputy Director Ryan Foster stepped out of the first vehicle with his credentials already in his hand. He was a tall man in his early 40s with short hair and eyes that scanned the building like he was looking for threats. Behind him, 8 FBI agents formed up, and they all carried themselves like professional law enforcement. Inside the police station, Officer Nathan Price was at the front desk when the doors opened hard. He looked up and his greeting died before he could say it, because he saw all the agents coming toward him. Ryan announced in a loud voice that carried through the lobby, "I am Deputy Director Ryan Foster of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm here to get Director Carmen Williams." "Where is she?" Nathan's mouth opened and closed several times before he could speak. He said, "She isn't holding," but Ryan cut him off and said, "Take me to her now." Before Nathan could respond, Police Chief Martin Cooper came out from the back offices and his face was white. He had just gotten off the phone with the FBI's Office of Congressional Affairs, and they had explained in very clear terms exactly who was sitting in his holding cell. Martin said, "Deputy Director Foster, I am Chief Cooper. I have just been informed of the situation and I apologize deeply for the confusion and—" Ryan interrupted him and ignored his offered handshake. He said, "Where is Director Williams?" Martin said, "This way, please follow me." As the group moved through the station, officers stopped what they were doing to stare. The sight of so many federal agents moving with purpose through their building was something none of them had ever seen before. Whispers spread quickly through the department. Someone said that is the FBI. Another person said they are here for that woman. A third person asked the one who said she was the director. Someone else said, "Oh my God, was she telling the truth the whole time?" In Sergeant Henderson's office, Paul was in the middle of yelling at Lisa Grant when his phone rang. It was the chief. The chief said, "Henderson, get down to holding cell C immediately. The FBI is here." Paul's stomach felt like it dropped and he said, "Sir, I can explain what happened." The chief said, "Save it and just get down here right now." Lisa looked at Paul and her face was pale. She said, "The FBI is here." Paul said grimly, "Come on, we need to face this now." In the holding cell, Carmen had been sitting quietly with her eyes closed like she was meditating. Kelly Davis had been watching her with growing curiosity. Kelly said, "You really are someone important, are you not?" Before Carmen could answer, they heard the sound of many footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes and stood up as a group of people appeared outside the cell. There were federal agents and the police chief and several officers who had been so dismissive of her just hours earlier. Ryan Foster said, "Director Williams, are you all right?" His relief was visible on his face. Carmen said, "I am fine, Ryan. Just eager to get back to work." Chief Cooper stepped forward and his hands were shaking a little as he unlocked the cell door. He said, "Director Williams, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for this misunderstanding. If I had known." Carmen stepped out of the cell and said, "If you had known, you would have verified my identity when I first requested it, which is what should have happened regardless of who I claimed to be." The chief nodded and looked miserable. He said, "You are absolutely right. This is completely unacceptable and I take full responsibility." Carmen looked past him to where Paul Henderson and Lisa Grant and Kevin Morrison and Brandon Cole stood in a line. All of them looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them. Lisa began to say, "Director, I apologize for." Carmen held up a hand and stopped her from talking. She looked at each officer in turn and her expression was unreadable. Carmen said quietly, "Do you know why I joined the FBI? It was not because I wanted power or to be important. It was because I believed in justice. Real justice. The kind that treats every person with dignity no matter what they look like or where they come from. The officer said nothing and could not meet her eyes. Carmen continued, today you failed to provide that justice. Not because you arrested me. Anyone in my position should understand that sometimes situations are confusing and mistakes happen. No, you failed because once you made your initial judgment, you closed your minds. You mocked me. You made jokes. You saw a black woman claiming to be someone important, and you decided without any actual investigation that I must be lying. Paul started to say, Director, Carmen said firmly, I am not finished. Every single one of you had multiple opportunities to verify my identity. I gave you authentication codes. I explained the situation clearly. I remained calm and professional despite being treated like a criminal. And yet you chose to believe your own assumptions rather than do your due diligence. She paused to let her words sink in. She said, I am going to leave here now and return to my duties, but I want each of you to think very carefully about today. Think about how you judge people. Think about the assumptions you make. And think about what might happen when you meet someone else who seems unlikely to be telling the truth. Because next time it might not be someone with the resources to prove themselves. It might be someone whose life depends on you believing them. The silence that followed felt very heavy. Carmen turned to Chief Cooper and said, I will expect a full report on this incident within 48 hours. I want to know what changes you are going to make to ensure this does not happen again. The chief said, yes, ma'am, absolutely. Carmen then looked at Kelly Davis, who was still sitting in the cell. She asked, what is her situation? Lisa blinked because she was surprised by the question. She said she is charged with domestic assault but claims it was self-defense. Carmen asked pointedly, have you investigated her claims? Lisa said weakly, we were going to look into it. Carmen said, do it today. If her injuries support her story, I expect those charges to be dropped and the real criminal to be arrested. She pulled out one of Ryan's business cards and handed it to Kelly. She said, if they do not follow through, call this number and ask for me personally. Kelly took the card with shaking hands and tears were streaming down her face. She said, thank you. Carmen nodded and then turned to Ryan. She said, let us go. We have work to do. The ride back to FBI headquarters was quiet at first. Carmen sat in the back of the lead SUV with Ryan Foster beside her. Both of them were processing everything that had happened. Ryan finally broke the silence and said the surveillance equipment at the warehouse was a complete loss. But we managed to get the hard drives from the command vehicle before the fire spread. We have everything. 6 months of recorded transactions and communications and financial records. It is enough to prosecute not just the people we arrested today, but the entire network. Carmen nodded and looked out the window at the passing city lights. She asked, what is the status of the 19 victims? Ryan said medical examinations are complete and all of them are receiving trauma counseling. Most are foreign nationals, so we are working with the State Department and various embassies. 3 are American citizens who were reported missing over the past 2 years. Their families have been notified. Carmen said, good. She was quiet for a moment and then said, the operation was successful, Ryan. Do not lose sight of that because of what happened to me afterward, Ryan said with respect. Director, you were arrested and held for 5 hours because you were trying to save those people. That is not nothing. Carmen said, no, it is not nothing, but it is also a teaching moment. Those officers tonight represent a problem that exists throughout law enforcement. Not malice necessarily, but a failure of imagination. A failure to consider that their first impression might be wrong. Ryan said they should have verified your identity immediately. Carmen said they should have, but they did not, and now we need to figure out why and how to fix it. She pulled out her phone, which Ryan had given her once they left the police station. She said, I want to set up a meeting with our training division. This incident is going to become a case study. Paul asked Carmen if she was threatening him. Carmen looked at him and said, I am stating facts. Paul's face got red and he looked angry now. He told Carmen that she was going to be processed and photographed and fingerprinted, just like any other criminal. He said she would get one phone call like everyone else. But he was not going to waste time chasing down her fantasy stories about working for the federal government. Carmen said quietly, you are making a huge mistake. Paul shot back and said, the only mistake being made here is yours. You should have thought of a more believable story to tell us. The booking area was busy with the usual evening activity when they brought Carmen in. Officer Nathan Price was handling her processing and he looked bored. He said, empty your pockets without looking up from his paperwork. Carmen said, I already told the officers who arrested me that I have nothing. Everything was lost in the explosion. Nathan finally looked at her and his eyebrows went up. He said, the explosion, right? The one you totally did not cause. He held up a clear plastic bag and said, so no wallet, and no phone, and no keys, and nothing at all. Carmen said, that is correct. Nathan made a note and said, that is very convenient. He asked her name, and Carmen said Carmen Elizabeth Williams. Nathan asked for her address, and Carmen paused before saying, I have homes in both Washington, D.C. and Virginia, but the addresses are classified for security reasons. Nathan looked up again, and this time he was clearly amused. He said, classified, of course they are. He turned to Officer Amy Peterson, who was working nearby, and said, hey, Amy, we have another important person here. She will not give us her address because it is classified. Amy looked over and smiled. She said, let me guess, witness protection or undercover spy or Secret Service. Nathan said FBI director, actually. And both officers started laughing hard. Carmen's face stayed neutral, but people watching closely could see her jaw muscles getting tight. Carmen said, this is not funny. Every minute you waste is another minute those trafficking criminals have to destroy evidence and disappear. Nathan was still grinning when he said, well, Director Williams, since you will not give an address, we will just put down homeless. Does that work for you? Carmen said, I'm not homeless. I am the director of... Nathan interrupted and said, yeah, the FBI director, we got it. He pointed at the camera against the wall and said, go stand over there for your photo. Carmen walked to the spot and stood up straight even though she had been through so much. When the flash went off, she stared directly into the camera with a look that was not angry or defeated, but just patient. Very patient in a way that should have worried them. Nathan told her to turn to the right, and she did. Then he said, turn to the left, and another flash went off. He said, all right, now come over here for fingerprints. As Carmen pressed her fingers onto the electronic scanner, Nathan kept making jokes. He said, you know, in all my years doing this, I have never fingerprinted the FBI director before. This is really exciting for me. Carmen said, your mockery is noted, Officer Price. Badge number 4729, correct? I can see it from here. Nathan's smile got smaller, and he asked if she was threatening him. Carmen said, I am observing, the same way I have observed every name and badge number and face in this building. The same way I have observed every mistake you have made and every time you acted unprofessionally. She looked right at him and said, I forget nothing, Officer Price, and neither does the federal government. For a moment, Nathan looked uncertain. Then he shook his head, and his cocky smile came back. He said, you are really something, lady. Really committed to playing this role. After the fingerprinting was done, Carmen was led to a holding cell. The cell already had 2 other women in it. One was sleeping on a bench, and the other was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up to her chest. Nathan unlocked the door and said, home sweet home. Try not to run any federal operations from in here. The door slammed shut with a loud clang, and Carmen looked around the cell. It was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet with concrete walls painted an ugly beige color. There was a toilet in the corner with no privacy, and the light above kept buzzing on and off. The woman on the floor looked up at Carmen with red eyes. She asked, what are you in for? Carmen sat down on the bench across from the sleeping woman and said, arson apparently, among other things. The woman asked, did you do it? Carmen said, no. I'm actually trying to stop a criminal organization, but these officers have decided I am lying. The woman let out a bitter laugh and said, yeah, they do not listen. I tried to tell them my boyfriend was beating me and I was just defending myself, but they arrested me anyway. Carmen looked at the woman more closely and noticed bruises on her arms and a cut on her lip. She asked, what is your name? The woman said, Kelly Davis. Carmen said, I am Carmen. She paused and then asked Kelly, when you got your phone call, who did you contact? Kelly said, a public defender, but I do not think it will help much. She wiped at her eyes and asked Carmen if she got her phone call yet. Carmen said, not yet, but when I do, things are going to change very quickly around here. Kelly said, you sound pretty confident for someone sitting in a jail cell. Carmen smiled just a little and said, that is because I know something these officers do not know. Kelly asked, what is that? Carmen said, the truth always comes out. It is just a matter of time. 3 hours after they arrested her, Carmen was finally allowed to make her phone call. Officer Brandon Cole walked her to a small room with an old phone on the wall. The phone had a metal cord that looked like it had not been changed since the 1990s. Brandon leaned against the door and said, you get 5 minutes. And just so you know, we record all calls from holding. Carmen said, I am aware. She picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. Brandon watched her and he was barely hiding his amusement. He said, let me guess you are calling FBI headquarters. Carmen did not answer him. The phone rang once and then twice, and then someone picked up and said, Deputy Director's office, this is Agent Ryan Foster speaking. Martin paused and made eye contact with several officers around the room. He said, I want you all to ask yourselves honestly, Would you have treated her the same way if she had been a white man in a suit? If she had looked the way you think an FBI director should look? The uncomfortable shifting in the room was answer enough. Martin continued, Director Williams has offered to work with us. She is sending a training team to help us develop better verification protocols and to address implicit bias in our assessment procedures. We are going to participate fully and enthusiastically. This is not optional. Someone asked, when does this start? Martin said, next week. In the meantime, I want written statements from everyone who had contact with Director Williams last night. Not to punish you, but to understand exactly where our procedures broke down. We are going to learn from this, and we are going to be better. Across town at FBI headquarters, Carmen Williams was conducting her own meeting with her senior leadership team. She stood before a room full of special agents in charge from various field offices. She said, the Riverside incident shows us a larger problem. How many times have our own agents encountered similar situations? How many times have we dismissed someone's credibility based on how they looked rather than what they were saying? She pulled up a presentation on the screen behind her. She said last year alone we had 47 formal complaints from members of the public who claimed they tried to report information to our field offices and were dismissed or not taken seriously. 47. And those are just the ones who took the time to file official complaints. How many others simply walked away and never came back? The agents in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Carmen continued, I am implementing a new protocol. Every field office will conduct quarterly training on verification procedures and implicit bias. We will establish clearer guidelines for how to handle walk-in reports in unusual situations, and we will create an anonymous feedback system so that people who feel they were not taken seriously can report it without fear of problems. Special Agent in Charge Christine Webb raised her hand. She said, Director, with respect, some of those complaints are likely from people who were correctly assessed as not credible. We cannot chase down every conspiracy theory or false report. Carmen said, you are right, Christine. We cannot and should not waste resources on obviously false claims, but there is a way to decline to investigate something while still treating the person with respect and dignity. And there is a difference between professionally declining to pursue a lead and mocking someone, or dismissing them without consideration. She moved to the next slide, which showed statistical data. She said research shows that members of minority communities, particularly women of color, are less likely to report crimes or suspicious activity to law enforcement because they do not believe they will be taken seriously. That is not just a policing problem. It is a national security problem. How much critical intelligence are we missing because potential sources do not trust us? The room was quiet as the agents took in this information. Carmen said, last night I experienced firsthand what many Americans experience regularly when they interact with law enforcement. And while it was frustrating and humiliating, it was also educational. We can do better. We must do better. After the meeting, Ryan Foster found Carmen in her office staring out the window at the Washington, D.C. skyline. He said, you are making this incident into something constructive. Carmen said, that is the only way it has value. If I just get angry and demand people be fired, nothing changes. The same biases and the same assumptions and the same failures will keep happening. But if we use it as a catalyst for genuine reform, then maybe something good comes out of it. Ryan said the media is starting to pick up the story. Someone at Riverside leaked what happened. Carmen turned from the window and said, I expected that. Have the press office prepare a statement. Something brief and focused on the successful trafficking operation. If they ask about my arrest, we acknowledge it happened and we explain. It was a case of miscommunication during a chaotic situation, and we emphasize that we are working with the Riverside PD to improve protocols. Ryan asked, are you not angry? Carmen smiled slightly and said, oh, I am angry. I am very angry, but anger without purpose is just noise. I would rather use that energy to make sure the next person in a similar situation has a better outcome. Ryan said, for what it is worth, I think you handled it perfectly, both in the moment and now. Carmen said, I handled it the only way I could. By remembering that everyone deserves dignity, even people who have not extended that same dignity to you. That is what leadership is, Ryan. It is not about using power when you have it. It is about showing grace when you could justifiably do otherwise. 3 weeks after the incident, Carmen Williams returned to Riverside County. This time she was not under arrest, but was there as a guest of honor at the police department's new training initiative. The auditorium was filled with officers from Riverside and surrounding counties. All of them were gathered to participate in the first session of the new verification and implicit bias training program. The atmosphere was tense because everyone knew what had happened and many were uncomfortable with being examined. Chief Martin Cooper introduced Carmen to polite but cautious applause. Carmen walked to the front and instead of standing behind the podium, she stood directly in front of the assembled officers. She said, 3 weeks ago I made one of the biggest mistakes of my career. She paused and then said, wait, that is wrong. I did not make the mistake, you did. A few nervous laughs went through the crowd. Carmen said, but I am not here to shame you or punish you. I am here because I believe in redemption and I believe in improvement. What happened to me 3 weeks ago was a failure. A failure of procedure and a failure of imagination and yes, a failure to see past your own assumptions. But failures can be powerful teachers if we are willing to learn from them. She used a remote to change the screen behind her, and it showed a photo of the holding cell where she had been kept. She said, this is where I spent 5 hours after conducting a successful federal operation that resulted in the rescue of 19 trafficking victims and the arrest of 47 suspects. I sat in this cell wearing clothes that smelled like smoke and covered in dirt and bruises, while officers outside joked about my claims and questioned my mental health. The officers in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Carmen said, now I want you to imagine something. Imagine that instead of me who eventually had the resources and credentials to prove herself, it had been one of those trafficking victims. Imagine one of them had escaped on their own and made it to your police station and tried to report what was happening. Would you have believed them? Or would you have made assumptions based on how they looked and how they smelled and whether they had the right documentation? The silence in the room was very deep. Carmen said softly, that is the real lesson here. It is not that you arrested the FBI director, and that was embarrassing for you. It is that your procedures and your prejudices, whether conscious or unconscious, prevented you from doing your actual job, which is to investigate and verify and protect. If you had just followed basic procedure and verified my identity, this would have been a minor inconvenience. Instead, it became a teaching moment for the entire law enforcement community. She moved to the next slide, which showed a flowchart. She said, so let us talk about what should have happened. When someone makes a claim that seems unusual or extraordinary, what is the first step? For the next 2 hours, Carmen walked the officers through a detailed protocol for verification and documentation, and professional skepticism that did not cross into dismissiveness. She shared examples from her own career both as an agent and as director of times when the most unlikely sources had provided critical information. She emphasized the key is to separate your assessment of someone's claim from your assessment of their credibility as a person. You can think someone's story sounds far-fetched and still treat them with respect. You can be professionally skeptical without being personally dismissive. During the break, several officers approached Carmen, including Lisa Grant, who had been quiet throughout the presentation. Lisa said, Director Williams, I owe you a personal apology. The way I treated you in that interrogation room makes me ashamed. I let my assumptions override my professionalism. Carmen looked at her for a moment and then nodded. She said, I accept your apology, Detective Grant. But more importantly, I need you to commit to doing better going forward. Use what you felt when you realized your mistake. Let that discomfort drive you to be more thorough and more open-minded and more professional in the future. Lisa said, I will. I absolutely will. Kevin Morrison and Brandon Cole also approached and both looked sorry for what they had done. Kevin said, we have been thinking a lot about that night, about all the chances we had to do the right thing and we did not take them. Carmen said, good. Keep thinking about it. And the next time you meet someone who seems too unlikely to be telling the truth, remember this feeling and do the work to verify instead of dismiss. At the end of the day, Chief Cooper walked Carmen to her car. He said, I cannot thank you enough for doing this, for turning what could have been a disaster into something constructive. Carmen said the disaster would have been if nothing changed. What happened to me was inconvenient and frustrating, but if it leads to better training and better procedures and better outcomes for the community you serve, then it was worth it. The chief said still not everyone would have been so generous. Carmen said, Chief Cooper, I have spent my entire career in law enforcement. I know the pressures officers face and the split-second decisions you have to make and the constant skepticism that comes with the job. But I also know that we can do better. We have to do better, because at the end of the day, people's lives depend on whether we choose to help them or dismiss them. She opened her car door and then paused. She said, by the way, did you follow up on Kelly Davis's case, the woman who was in the cell with me? Martin nodded and said we did. It turned out her story was true. Her boyfriend had been abusing her for months. We arrested him and dropped the charges against her and connected her with victim services. She asked me to thank you specifically. Carmen said no thanks necessary. That is what we are supposed to do. Protect victims and hold abusers accountable, every single time, regardless of what the situation looks like on the surface. As Carmen drove away from Riverside County, she thought about the past 3 weeks. The trafficking operation had been a success beyond her initial hopes. All 47 defendants had been indicted, and the victim services team was working with each of the 19 rescued individuals to provide support and help them rebuild their lives. Federal prosecutors were confident they could dismantle the entire trafficking network. The incident at the police station, while humiliating at the time, had started important conversations across law enforcement agencies nationwide. Other departments were reaching out and asking for similar training. The FBI's training division was developing a comprehensive curriculum based on lessons learned from the incident. But most importantly to Carmen, the incident had reminded her why she had entered law enforcement in the first place. Not for power or to be important, but because she believed in justice. Real justice applied fairly to everyone regardless of their circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ryan Foster that said press conference went well. All major outlets are covering the trafficking bust. Minimal focus on your arrest, mostly focusing on the victim's rescue and successful prosecutions. Carmen smiled and typed back perfect. That is where the focus should be. As she got onto the highway back to Washington, D.C., Carmen thought about Kelly Davis and about the 19 trafficking victims and about all the people whose lives had been changed by the operation. That was what mattered, not the embarrassment of being arrested, and not the mockery she had endured, but the lives that had been saved and the justice that had been served. And if her experience could help even one person in the future, someone who walked into a police station desperate for help and struggling to be believed, then sitting in that cell for 5 hours had been worth every single minute. In the end, that was what leadership meant, not protecting your own dignity, but using your experiences, even the painful ones, to make things better for others. To create a world where everyone, regardless of how they looked or what their circumstances were, could be heard and believed and protected. Carmen Williams had always believed in that vision of justice. Now she had an even clearer understanding of why it mattered and an even stronger commitment to making it real. Back at FBI headquarters, Carmen met with Ryan and several other senior officials to review the final reports from the trafficking operation. The conference room table was covered with documents and evidence photos and charts showing the connections between all 47 defendants. Ryan said the U.S. Attorney's Office is extremely pleased with what we delivered. They are calling it one of the most comprehensive trafficking prosecutions in the past decade. Carmen nodded and said, "What about the victims? How are they doing?" One of the victim services coordinators said all 19 are in safe housing now. The 3 American citizens have been reunited with their families. The 16 foreign nationals are working with immigration services, and most will likely receive special visas as victims of trafficking. Carmen said, "Good. Make sure they all have access to long-term counseling and support. These people have been through trauma that most of us cannot imagine. We owe them more than just rescuing them. We owe them a real chance to rebuild their lives." The coordinator said, "Understood, Director. We are committed to providing comprehensive support for as long as they need it." Carmen turned to the intelligence analyst on her team and asked, "What have we learned about the network structure?" The analyst pulled up a chart on the screen and said the warehouse was just one node in a much larger operation. "We have identified connections to similar operations in 6 other states. With the evidence we gathered, we can now map the entire network and coordinate with field offices to take down the other locations." Carmen said, "Make that a priority. I want coordinated raids planned within the next 2 weeks. Every single person involved in this network needs to be arrested and prosecuted, and every single victim needs to be identified and rescued." Ryan said, "We are already coordinating with those field offices. They are standing by for your authorization." Carmen said, "You have it. Execute the operation as soon as everything is in place." She looked around the room at her team and said, "I want everyone to understand something. What we did 3 weeks ago matters. Not because it was dramatic or because of what happened to me afterward, but because we saved 19 lives. We gave 19 people their freedom back. And now we have the opportunity to save many more." One of the agents said, "Director, if you had not insisted on personally overseeing the warehouse operation, we might not have gotten the evidence we needed." Carmen shook her head and said, "If I had not been separated during the extraction, We would have wrapped up the operation hours earlier and avoided a lot of complications. But that is the nature of this work. Things do not always go according to plan. What matters is that we adapt and we persevere, and we never lose sight of why we are doing this. After the meeting, Carmen returned to her office and found a stack of messages waiting for her. Several were from other law enforcement agencies asking about the new training protocols. A few were from members of Congress requesting briefings on the trafficking operation. And one was from Kelly Davis. Carmen opened the message from Kelly first. It was a handwritten note that had been scanned and sent electronically. The note said, "Dear Director Williams, I do not have the words to thank you for what you did for me. Not just giving me your card, but for seeing me as a person who mattered when everyone else just saw me as a problem. Because of you, I am free from someone who hurt me. Because of you, I have hope for the first time in years. I will never forget your kindness. Thank you. Kelly Davis." Carmen read the note twice and then carefully filed it in a folder she kept for messages that reminded her why she did this job. Her phone rang and she saw it was the president calling. She answered and said, "Good evening, Mr. President." The president said, "Carmen, I wanted to call personally to congratulate you on the trafficking operation. The Attorney General briefed me on the results and I am extremely impressed." Carmen said, "Thank you, sir. It was a team effort and I had excellent agents working with me." The president said, "I also heard about what happened with your arrest in Riverside County. Are you all right?" Carmen said, "I am fine, sir. It was an unfortunate situation, but we are turning it into an opportunity for improvement across law enforcement." The president was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know, most people in your position would be demanding heads roll and making this into a big scandal." Carmen said, "With respect, sir, that would not accomplish anything useful. The officers who arrested me made mistakes, but they were not acting with malicious intent. They were acting on assumptions and biases that exist throughout our society. The better response is to address those underlying issues rather than just punish individuals." The president said, "That is why I appointed you to this position, Carmen. You understand that real change comes from addressing root causes, not just treating symptoms." Carmen said, "I learned that lesson long before I became director, sir. I learned it from personal experience." The president said, "Well, I want you to know that I have complete confidence in you and in how you handled this situation. Keep up the excellent work." Carmen said, "Thank you, Mr. President." After hanging up, Carmen sat back in her chair and allowed herself a moment of reflection. 3 weeks ago, she had been sitting in a holding cell being mocked and dismissed. Now she was receiving congratulations from the president and implementing reforms that would affect law enforcement agencies across the country. The contrast was striking but also instructive. Power and respect were fragile things. They could be stripped away in an instant by circumstances beyond your control. But dignity and integrity were different. Those came from within and no one could take them away unless you surrendered them. Carmen had maintained her dignity in that holding cell not because she knew she would eventually be vindicated, but because that was who she was. That was who she had always been. Her office door opened and Ryan came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Carmen and said, "I figured you could use this. It has been a long few weeks." Carmen took the coffee gratefully and said, "Thank you, Ryan, for the coffee and for everything else, for coming to get me that night, for supporting the training initiatives, for believing in what we are trying to do." Ryan sat down across from her and said, "You do not need to thank me for any of that. It is my job, and more than that, it is the right thing to do." He paused and then said, "Can I ask you something?" Carmen said, "Of course." Ryan said, "How did you stay so calm that night?" "In the cell and during the interrogation, I do not think I could have maintained that composure." Carmen was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. She said, "I stayed calm because I have been in situations like that before. Not exactly like that, obviously, but situations where I was not believed, or where people made assumptions about me based on how I looked. You learn early as a black woman in America that losing your temper or showing anger just reinforces the stereotypes people already have. So you learn to stay calm, to be twice as professional and twice as composed, because anything less will be used against you." Ryan said, "That is not fair." Carmen smiled sadly and said, "No, it is not fair, but it is reality. And rather than just be angry about that reality, I try to use my position to change it. That is why the training initiatives matter so much. That is why we need to address implicit bias and teach officers to verify rather than assume. Because the next person in that situation might not have my resources or my position. They might just be an ordinary person trying to report a crime or asking for help, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like." Ryan nodded and said, "I understand." And for what it is worth, I think what you are doing is going to make a real difference. Carmen said, I hope so, because at the end of the day, that is all any of us can do. Try to leave things a little better than we found them. Try to make the system a little more just and a little more fair. Try to ensure that the next person who needs help actually receives it. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, drinking their coffee. Then Ryan said the team is planning a small celebration for the successful operation. Nothing fancy, just dinner with everyone who worked on the case. Will you come? Carmen said I would not miss it. Those agents did excellent work and they deserve to be recognized for it. As Ryan left, Carmen turned back to her computer and began working on the report for the Attorney General. She detailed every aspect of the operation from the initial intelligence gathering through the final arrests. She included recommendations for how to coordinate similar multi-state operations in the future, and she added a section on lessons learned, not just about the tactical aspects, but about the importance of treating every person with dignity, whether they were a victim or a suspect, or simply someone seeking help. When she finally finished writing, it was late evening. The building was quiet and most of the staff had gone home. Carmen saved the document and sent it to the Attorney General's office. Then she packed up her briefcase and prepared to leave. As she walked through the empty corridors of FBI headquarters, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a young girl growing up in a working-class neighborhood, to a special agent working cases in the field, to eventually becoming the director of the entire bureau. It had not been an easy path. There had been obstacles and setbacks and moments when she had questioned whether it was worth it. But nights like tonight, when she could look back at 19 lives saved and a major criminal network dismantled, reminded her why she had persevered. This was the work that mattered. This was the difference one person could make when they refused to give up on the ideals of justice and equality and human dignity. Carmen walked out to her car and drove through the quiet streets of Washington, D.C. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new cases and new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight she allowed herself to feel satisfied with what had been accomplished. The trafficking victims were safe. The criminals were in custody. And a police department in Riverside County was learning to do better. It was not perfect, but it was progress. And progress was all anyone could really ask for. As Carmen pulled into her driveway, she thought one more time about Kelly Davis and that handwritten note. Thank you for seeing me as a person who mattered. That was the essence of everything, was it not? Seeing every person as someone who mattered. Treating every person with the dignity they deserved. Using whatever power and position you had not to elevate yourself but to lift up others. That was what justice really meant. Not just laws and prosecutions and arrests, but a fundamental recognition of the worth and humanity of every single person. Carmen Williams had spent her entire career fighting for that kind of justice. And despite the setbacks and the frustrations and even the humiliation of being arrested and mocked in a holding cell, she had no intention of stopping now. There was too much work left to do, too many people who still needed help, too many systems that still needed reform, but she was ready for it. She had always been ready for it, and she always would be. Ryan raised his eyebrows and said, "You are going to use what happened to you as a training tool." Carmen said, "Why not? It is perfect. It shows everything that can go wrong when officers rely on assumptions instead of procedure. And it reminds everyone that the people we are supposed to protect and serve come from all backgrounds and all circumstances. Sometimes the person who needs help will not look the way you expect them to." Ryan said the Riverside County Police Department is going to be very embarrassed when this gets out. Carmen shook her head and said this does not need to become a public scandal. That is not the goal. The goal is improvement. Chief Cooper seemed genuinely horrified by what happened. That is a good sign. It means he is open to change. Ryan said you are being very generous. Carmen said I am being practical. Destroying that department does not save the next person who gets dismissed or mocked, because they do not fit an officer's idea of what credible looks like. But working with them and training them and showing them a better way might actually make a difference. Ryan was quiet for a moment and then smiled slightly. He said, "You know, some people in your position would have come out of that cell, demanding that people be fired." Carmen said, "Some people in my position have never been on the other side of that table. I have. Before I became an agent and before I worked my way up through the ranks, I was just another black woman in America. I know what it feels like to not be believed. To be dismissed. To have people make assumptions about who you are and what you are capable of based on how you look." Ryan asked, "Is that why you stayed calm in there? In the cell?" Carmen said I stayed calm because getting angry would not have helped, and because I knew the truth would come out eventually. It always does. She checked her watch and asked, "What time is the press briefing about the trafficking bust?" Ryan said, "Tomorrow at 10 in the morning. We have coordinated with the United States Attorney's Office. They are prepared to announce indictments on 47 defendants." Carmen repeated the number quietly and said 47. "All part of the same network we have been tracking." Ryan said, "Thanks to your operation tonight, yes. The warehouse was the key. Once we had surveillance inside, everything else fell into place." Carmen allowed herself a slight smile and said, "Then it was worth sitting in that cell for a few hours." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She looked at the screen and saw it was the Attorney General. She answered and said, "This is Williams." The Attorney General said, "Carmen, I just heard what happened tonight. Are you all right?" Carmen said, "I am fine, Eleanor. A bit dirty and bruised, but nothing serious." The Attorney General said, "The President is going to want a briefing on this. Not just the trafficking operation, but your arrest too." Carmen sighed and said, "I would prefer to keep that part quiet. We got the results we needed. The rest is just noise." The Attorney General said, "The FBI director getting arrested and held for 5 hours is not noise, Carmen. It is a potential scandal. And if we do not control the story, someone else will." Carmen said, "With respect, I do not think it needs to be a story at all. Mistakes were made and they are being corrected and we are moving forward." The Attorney General said, "You are more forgiving than I would be." Carmen said, "I am not interested in forgiveness. I am interested in fixing the problem so it does not happen to someone else. Someone who does not have the resources and credentials to prove themselves." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The Attorney General said, "That is why you are good at this job, Carmen. You see the bigger picture." Carmen said, "Thank you, Eleanor. I will have a full report on your desk by morning." After ending the call, Carmen leaned back in her seat. Ryan looked at her with concern and said, "You should go home and get some rest, Director. It has been a very long day." Carmen said, "It has been a long day. But first I need to check on the victims personally. Those 19 people went through hell. The least I can do is make sure they know that someone at the highest levels of law enforcement cares about what happened to them." Ryan said, "That is above and beyond your duties." Carmen said, "No, Ryan, that is my duty. Every single victim matters. That is what I tried to explain to those officers tonight. Every person matters regardless of who they are or where they come from. If we lose sight of that, we lose sight of why we do this job in the first place." The next morning, Chief Martin Cooper called an emergency meeting with his senior staff at the Riverside County Police Department. The conference room was packed with sergeants and detectives and supervisors. All of them knew that something major had happened the previous night. Martin stood at the head of the table and said, "I'm going to be very direct with all of you. Last night we arrested and detained Director Carmen Williams of the FBI. For 5 hours she repeatedly told us who she was and asked us to verify her identity. We did not do that. We mocked her and we processed her like a common criminal and we put her in a holding cell." The room erupted in shocked voices and whispers. Martin continued and said, "I have spoken with Director Williams this morning. She has agreed not to pursue this as a federal incident, which is more grace than we deserve. But she has requested and I have agreed that we implement immediate changes to how we handle situations like this." Sergeant Paul Henderson, who had barely slept the night before, raised his hand. He said, "Chief, with respect, how are we supposed to know who she was? She had no identification and no badge and nothing." Martin said, "That is exactly the point, Paul. The absence of identification does not mean someone is lying. It means you need to do the work to verify their claims. Did anyone run her fingerprints through the FBI database? Did anyone call the number she provided and ask to verify her identity? Did anyone do anything except assume she was lying?" The room was completely silent. Martin said, "I have reviewed the recordings from the interrogation and the holding area. The dismissiveness and the mockery and the outright refusal to take her seriously is unacceptable. And it is not just unacceptable because she turned out to be who she said she was. It is unacceptable because that is not how we treat anyone in our custody." Lisa Grant spoke up and her voice was small. She said, "We are trained to be skeptical and to question people's stories." Martin said, "There is a difference between healthy skepticism and prejudicial dismissal." Director Williams remained calm and professional and consistent in her story. She provided specific details about an operation that you could have verified. She was not hostile or aggressive, and yet every single person who interacted with her treated her like she was crazy or lying.